we're live, according to Google. So thank you for those of you tuning in. Maybe we can hang out for a couple minutes while we can see if any viewers would like to join in. We had some of Google's technology has changed, so we've had to once again change the system that we're using, and hopefully that doesn't give anybody any difficulties or any problems. Send me an email. I'll be checking my email during the broadcast to see if anybody's having any problems. Oh, I've got echo.
I don't hear anything.
That's the live broadcast echoing in my ear, totally throwing me off. So apologies for that. So that's working. At least we know that. In any case, moving on, it's my pleasure to introduce Emily Parke, who is a lecturer here at the same university that I'm at the University of Auckland. She's in the philosophy department. She did her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, spending time in the biology and philosophy departments there. Has interest in philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, and also the history of life sciences. And she also has worked with a number of people from the artificial life community that are sort of, I guess, big fish type people. So Mark Beddoe and Norman Packard and Martin Hanchik and Takashi Akagami, all of these people, Emily has spent some time working with, mostly in Italy. Isn't that right, Emily?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. So today, Emily is going to be talking about models and simulation and experiments and surprise. It should be roughly a 20-minute seminar, and then we'll have some discussion here. We've got a few live participants, which is great. And I'll switch the screen over to you, Emily. And then if you can share your slides and just take it away.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I will turn.
And then I'm going to mute myself, and maybe I'll mute you too, Mike, just in case. and then yeah, once the talk's over, we can unmute everybody and yeah, have some discussion.
I'll try to keep an eye on the clock, but feel free to unmute yourself and yell at me if I'm talking for too long.
Okay, will do.
Okay, great. I will share the screen. Great, can you see the slides?
Yes, okay. I can see the slide.
Okay, great. So thank you all. I'm gonna talk about a paper that I've been working on, challenging the view that experiments put scientists in a better position than simulations and models do to be productively surprised. So just a bit of broader context. There's a general feeling among philosophers of science especially, and also many scientists, that experiments are better than models and simulations. Typically better than in the sense that they generate better scientific knowledge or put scientists in a better position to make inferences about the natural world. So it's not uncommon, at least in biology, which is where my main scientific background is, to hear people say things like, interesting results, but it's just a simulation, or to express views like, all else being equal, it's better to do an experiment than a simulation or model. So of course, not everyone feels that way, but this line of thought is pretty pervasive. And a number of people have recently put it in writing. So just a few examples. Francesco Guala, who's a philosopher of science, says, ever since Galileo and Newton, it's been agreed generally that experiments constitute the ideal, most reliable source of scientific knowledge. Stephen Peck, who's an ecologist, says simulation's utility is debated, and some ecologists and evolutionary biologists view it with suspicion and even contempt. And Mary Morgan, another philosopher, writes, the intuition of most sciences and philosophy is that experiment is a more reliable guide to scientific knowledge than models. So many arguments for the superiority of experiments have tended to focus on the issue of external validity or inferential power. In other words, experiments put us in a better position than models do to make valid inferences from the thing we're studying to the natural world outside. There's a lot of different things that have been said there. The claim I'm going to focus on in this short talk is more specific and about surprise. So this claim says that simulations can't surprise us the way experiments can. It's a slightly different sort of claim than the external validity one. So here are two examples of people who have made the surprise claim. So Paul Sniegowski, discussing experiments versus simulations in biology, says, although surprises do emerge in simulations, in general what goes into a simulation is well known and surprises are not anticipated. In contrast, surprises and exceptions to anticipated results are fairly common in experiments. And Mary Morgan, again, talking about experiments versus simulations in general across science, says the potential for laboratory experiments to surprise and confound contrasts with the potential for simulations only to surprise. So by confounding, she has in mind causing us to seriously question our background theoretical knowledge, as opposed to just merely routinely seeing something that we weren't quite expecting to see. So from what I've gathered in a lot of conversations with people about experiments versus simulations, a lot of people believe some version of this view, and Morgan's one of the few who have put it in writing. So to be a bit more precise, I think there are at least 4 possible versions of what I'm calling the surprise claim. So first of all, you might think that simulations can't surprise us at all. A second version would say that fewer surprises occur in simulations or have occurred historically in simulations. A third version would say that simulations can be merely surprising, but they can't be confounding in Morgan's sense of confounding. And a fourth version would say that surprises from experiments are more valuable than surprises from simulations. I don't think anyone today would endorse that first version, that simulations can't surprise us at all, so I'm just gonna ignore that here. The second version is plausible and it might be true, but I don't think it's very philosophically interesting because it seems like an empirical claim contingent on the relative frequency of simulations versus experiments as scientific activities. So the really interesting claims, I think, are the third and the fourth one. So that's what I'm gonna focus on for the rest of the talk. So I'll say a bit about primarily why the third claim is wrong and a bit about the fourth at the end if there's time. So just to be clear what we're comparing here, when people compare experiments to simulations, they often have in mind computer simulations. But people also talk about simulation in a broader sense to mean a study of any models. So this would include computer and mathematical models, but also physical models like model airplanes, laboratory analog models, or model organisms. So just to confuse things a bit, in the 2 quotations of the surprise claim I just read, Snigowski was talking about lab experiments versus computer simulations, and Morgan was talking about lab experiments versus simulations in this broad sense. So I'm going to focus on the issue of experiments versus computer simulations. This is because I don't think that there's actually any interesting or important difference between experiments and studies of physical models. I won't get into the details of why given the time, but maybe we can talk more about that in questions. I think the interesting comparison here is between studying physical systems in the lab or the field versus studying computational or mathematical models. So that's what I'm talking about. So the intuition driving all 4 versions of the surprise claim has to do with the idea that when you do an experiment, you're studying something that's more like the natural world. So the kinds of systems in the natural world that scientists ultimately want to learn about, like human societies or biological populations or planets and galaxies, are really messy and complicated and full of exceptions to what we might expect once we take a look at them. So the idea behind the surprise claim is that when scientists study experimental things like fruit flies or human subjects, they're engaging with something that's plucked from that same messy, complicated world. And a bunch of details come along for free, which the experimenter didn't put there herself. Whereas when you do a simulation, you're studying a computer model and essentially engaging with a 2-dimensional thing made of mathematics on a screen, something that you made yourself. So the idea is that you know pretty much what it's made of and what it can do, at least at the outset. That's what I take to be the general line of thinking behind the surprise claim about the difference between experiments and models. So to respond to this claim, I distinguish between 2 sources of surprise. The first I call unexpected behaviors. So these are surprising states or phenomena that can be exhibited by something you're studying over the course of studying it. And unexpected behaviors are sometimes, but not always, signs of a second source of surprise, which I call hidden features. So these are sources of surprise that motivate us to rethink what we know about our object of study in a deeper way. So unexpected behaviors can surprise us by displaying some state of the thing we're studying which we didn't anticipate it being in, or by failing to straightforwardly refute a hypothesis in the sort of way we were expecting. And sometimes unexpected behaviors can motivate us to dig down and really question our knowledge of the way our object of study itself works. So this can involve uncovering hidden features, which I'm using as a sort of catch-all term to include hidden properties, mechanisms, causal factors, variables, or also hidden artifacts or bugs that cause us to rethink what our object of study is made of or how it works. So I'll use this characterization of sources of surprise to show why at least what I call the third version of the surprise claim is false. So I'll just discuss a few examples of what I have in mind by both of these. So unexpected behaviors. These are found in experiments all the time. I'm sure everyone can think of a million examples, but here's just one from experimental evolution. So experimental evolution is the propagation of organisms in the laboratory as a way to study evolution in real time. Typically microbes, because they're small and easy to study, and you can keep a lot of them in a small space. So a famous example of experimental evolution is Richard Lenski's long-term evolution experiment, which started with some E. coli, and using a single genotype of E. coli seeded 12 genetically identical populations in identical environments, just 12 flasks of bacterial growth medium, and started evolving them via serial transfer, which means every day as the population starts to use up resources in the flask, you transfer a representative sample to a new flask, and in that way the populations can keep evolving indefinitely. Lenski's experiment started in 1988 and it's still going today. So they've gotten tons of interesting results. Just one I'll mention, they found that about 4 years into the experiment, which was about 10,000 generations into the experiment, just 3 of their 12 populations had evolved surprisingly high genomic mutation rates, about 1 to 2 orders of magnitude higher than the ancestral mutation rate. So while most of the population's mutation rate stayed the same, 3 of them increased pretty strongly. So this is just a case of an object of study in an experimental context evolving features that the researchers weren't expecting to see and that they had to do some work to explain. So unexpected behaviors also occur all the time in simulations. Agent-based models are a source of really good examples. So these are models commonly used in ecology, the social sciences, and artificial life, where agents in the model can represent individual organisms and their interactions and behaviors and so forth. So keeping with the theme of studying evolving populations, Avita is an agent-based model which is used to study evolving populations of so-called digital organisms. Their genomes are strings of computer code, and they interact in an environment where they compete for resources in the form of computer memory. So in one study, Offrey and colleagues wanted to study a population that couldn't adapt, but that would accumulate deleterious or neutral mutations through genetic drift. So digital organisms are perfect for this because you have tons of control. So the idea was to examine each mutation as it occurred by running a copy of the mutant in a test environment and then measuring its fitness. So the test would allow you to identify which organisms in the main population had beneficial mutations and then kill them off, which in theory would stop all future adaptation in the main population. So the surprise they describe is that the population continued to evolve, continued to accumulate beneficial mutations. And it turned out that the digital organisms had apparently developed some way of detecting when they were in the test environments and downgrading the performance. So the authors argue that they were doing so not to be killed off, or that they had evolved predator avoidance. So just as in the last example, unexpected behaviors can show up in simulations where things go counter to what we expected and force us to rethink what's going on. So again, the extreme first version of the surprise claim that simulations can't genuinely surprise at all, which usually rests on the idea that they can't surprise at all because the modelers who write them know everything about the model, I think that's pretty clearly wrong. So a modeler will often know everything, at least about her model's initial conditions and transition rules, but not always. So a boring reason is if someone else wrote the model, but there are more interesting reasons too. So the model might be written in a high-level programming language, and some of its low-level details might be opaque. or it might be programmed in a way that leads to its initial conditions having unintended features, or its transition rules having unintended consequences. Also, really complicated models are often written by teams rather than single modelers, for example, in climate modeling. So in some cases, no individual researcher running simulations might be said to understand everything about the model. In any case, setting an initial state and deciding the rules that'll govern its change over time doesn't tell you what'll happen. That's why you have to run a simulation. Just like finding out as much as you can about an experimental system and sorting out the protocol doesn't tell you what will happen in the experiment. So I think any study of a system with an initial state and subsequent states has at least the potential to surprise because it contains potential unexpected behaviors as it changes over time or fails to change over time. So at least with respect to unexpected behaviors, I think the surprise claim is pretty straightforwardly wrong. So moving on to hidden features. Again, what I have in mind here is features of an object of study whose discovery is typically triggered by investigating an unexpected behavior. But unlike merely unexpected behaviors, these are deeply surprising features that you can discover in some sense that an object of study already had that you were unaware of when you started studying it. I think when people make the surprise claim, these arguably deeper kinds of sources of surprise are more typically what they have in mind. So my favorite example is the discovery of transposable elements. In the 1950s, Barbara McClintock here was studying the genetic basis of maze patterns, trying to figure out what gives rise to their characteristic modeled pattern. And she discovered that the gene regulating that pattern also makes the chromosomes break. So in the process of examining that breakage, she discovered that genes can move from one place to another on the chromosome with a sort of cut and paste mechanism, which refuted the earlier belief that genes' positions are fixed on the chromosome. So McClintock discovered transposable elements over the course of studying maze genomes, and their discovery was triggered by investigating a series of unexpected behaviors. But in an important sense, the source of surprise and the really productive discovery in this case was this hidden feature of our object of study that had been there all along that nobody previously knew was there. So I want to say that simulations can also contain hidden features. So sticking to examples from agent-based models, Sugarscape is this pretty simple agent-based model with cells in a grid that's used in the social sciences. So here every cell can contain resources or sugar at different concentrations represented by different shades of yellow. And there are these agents, the red dots, that can move around the grid. So the basic setup is with each time step, the agents look around for the nearest cell with the most sugar and move and metabolize it. So this random scattering of agents and simple rules can give rise to population level features that look a lot like the macrostructures that we see in societies of living organisms. So this is a video run of the simulation showing some distribution of wealth. There's also group level movement, migration patterns, and so forth. So this is a quotation from the model's designers discussing these population level structures. They say, the surprise consists precisely in the emergence of familiar macrostructures from the bottom up, from the simple local rules that outwardly appear remote from the social or collective phenomena they generate. In short, it's not the emergent object per se that's surprising, but the generative sufficiency of the simple local rules. So I think this last sentence is really key. This object of study that looks really simple has generative properties that you wouldn't have known about until studying it. And the interesting lesson in this case comes from that fact and studying how it works, not from the so-called familiar macrostructures observed in the model per se. So the reason I want to call this sort of case a hidden feature of these sorts of models is that you have these interesting behaviors in this family of models, plus this further discovery, which is something like, look at how we can systematically generate this complicated macro level behavior that looks a lot like what we see in the living world from these super simple rules governing dots on a screen. And since they wrote this book, it sparked a whole lot of research on emergent dynamics and generative models and what we can do with them. Okay, so maybe simulations can also contain hidden features. I'm wanting to say they do, but I think there's still a pull to want to say that there's a kind of hidden feature that only experiments can have. So here's what I have in mind. We can talk about hidden features existing in scientific objects of study at different levels. So for lack of better terms, I'm calling these the micro and macro level at the moment. So the micro level is the level of atoms or molecules or individuals. The macro level is the aggregate or population level. And I'm keeping the wording loose here because depending on the area of inquiry, what we call these levels of organization will vary. But it's worth noting this difference between the two examples of hidden features I discussed. The transposable elements case looks like the discovery of a molecular level hidden feature, and the sugarscape example looks more like a population or aggregate level feature. So it seems tempting to say that here might be the grain of truth in the surprise claim, that there's this particular kind of source of surprise that might be unique to experimental contexts, these micro-level hidden features. But so I think there are cases of discovering micro-level hidden features in simulations too. So I'll just mention a quick example. There's a paper that Leonard discusses in 2006, an example of a molecular dynamics simulation which uncovered properties of gold that no one previously knew about. So in particular, when nickel tips are held against gold plates and removed, the gold deforms and makes these nanoscale wires. And the people who wrote the model said this was surprising because gold wasn't supposed to do this. And they later confirmed the simulation results by atomic force microscopy. So I think this is a great example of how these sort of micro-level hidden features can be uncovered in simulations too, though I wonder if being surprised in this way by micro-level hidden features might be particular to contexts like this, where the model's based on a significant, well-known body of theory about the physical microstructure of the part of the natural world in question. Okay. So wrapping up, back to the third version of the surprise claim, which says simulations can be surprising but not confounding. By getting more precise about different ways to think about sources of surprise, I've said why I think this is wrong as a generalization across science. Both experiments and simulations have the potential to give rise to both unexpected behaviors and the discovery of hidden features. Although while there are examples of simulations revealing what I've called micro-level hidden features, I think it seems right to say that experiments might put us in a better position to uncover that kind of source of surprise, but it's a much more limited sense than what people making this surprise claim typically have in mind. So just saying a bit about the fourth version of the surprise claim, I don't think experiments and simulations are always or even often interchangeable or equally valuable regarding their capacities to surprise or in any other way. But I do think that generalizations across science about one being better than the other are problematic. So the generalizations like the ones made in all four versions of the surprise claim. So in particular classes of situations, there might well be reasons to think that experiments will be a contextually superior source of productive surprises compared to simulations, or the converse. In other words, while this fourth version of the surprise claim is false as a generic claim about science, it might be true with respect to specific contexts of inquiry. So in certain contexts where the aim is to understand how particular systems in the world actually work, we need empirical data to design useful and reliable simulations. But there are different sorts of contexts than those at stake in other examples I talked about, like sugarscape, where the aim is to understand complex patterns without regard for their instantiation in any particular system in the natural world beyond the model. So there, the model is a means of learning about the thing of interest, which are high-level patterns and dynamics, without getting hung up on messy particulars. So neither of these sorts of points, I think, should be extrapolated to generic claims about experiments versus simulations in principle across science. Okay, I'm running out of time, but final slide. So a common response at this point in favor of the view that surprises from experiments are more valuable than surprises from simulations is to say that when we're surprised by an experiment, we learn something about the world, whereas when we're surprised by a simulation, we learn something only about the computer model. So this is a point about questioning something like the believability or productivity of surprises from simulations versus experiments. It says surprises from experiments are directly valuable, whereas when we're surprised by a simulation, we have a bunch of work to do to show why it tells us anything about the world outside the model. So very briefly, my response is I think this wrong, because when we're surprised by an experiment, we learn something about our experimental system. There's always some degree of inferential work to do to get from claims about an experimental system or a model to claims about the rest of the world. So almost all of science is about studying something to learn about something else. And models are certainly representations of systems in the natural world, but experimental systems typically are too, I would want to say. They can vary hugely in their similarity to conditions outside the lab or their divergence from it. So in other words, it's true that modelers have to work to show why their models are relevantly similar to the natural world, but experimenters do as well. And there are lots of matters of degree there, but I don't think there's a clear line dividing experiments from models. So it's a misconception that just because we're studying a physical system, we automatically have privileged access to insights that are more directly revealing about our ultimate target of inquiry in nature. And with that, I will wrap up. Thanks.
Yay! Everybody's applauding, but it's muted.
Okay, I'll turn
Thanks a lot, Emily, for that. I'll just unmute everybody here. Mog, I can't unmute you. What's going on?
She self-muted.
There we go. All right. Oh, no, now you're muted again. Oh, no. Sorry about that. Great, cool. Thanks very much, Emily.
Yeah.
Really, interesting stuff, and we've got time now for some questions. One thing I wanted to ask you about is that word confound. Mm-hmm. Did the author that used that, did they define what they meant specifically about something that would be confounding? Because it kind of, I don't know, it just seems like often you're surprised and there's a degree to which you're surprised, and some things might take you longer to understand what's going on underneath, and that's kind of, in a loose way, what I was interpreting by the word confound. But I was wondering if they were more, I don't know, more precise about what they meant for something to be confounding.
Yeah, she describes the difference roughly in terms, as I understood it, of the extent to which the surprise causes you to overhaul what you knew going in. So I think what she has in mind is that merely surprising things are the sort of run-of-the-mill, explosions and things not going quite how you thought. But confounding results are those that make you step back and say, oh, maybe the thing I'm studying doesn't work the way I thought it did, or maybe I need to update my theory in light of what I've learned here. That's how I interpreted it anyway. And
I guess that relates a little bit to the sort of micro and macro level that you're talking about, right? Like when you build a model, you do have some lowest level at which is sort of the level at which you're designing the system. You've got your basic units, and I think it's basically impossible to be surprised about something at that basic level, the sort of atoms of your model. And I know you gave this example of the gold with the tin and everything, but it occurred to me that that's also not a micro, at least as I understand it, is not sort of a micro situation, right? Because it's sort of, you're talking about like the population dynamics of all of those atoms. Yes, they're really small microscopic things, but that they're not, but you're not surprised about the behavior of an individual atom. You're sort of surprised by the collective behavior of a group of atoms.
You are surprised by the behavior of individual atoms, and I wish, so I had a long conversation after my talk here in the physics department with someone who explained why to me, and I wish I had taken better notes because I don't remember enough about the details to re-explain it right now. But so that was my concern about the example as well, which was I've used as an example of a micro level hidden feature, but by micro, do I mean something like tiny, because we're talking about the aggregate of the entities in the model.
Right.
But yeah, I don't want to say anything stupid about molecular dynamics simulations because I don't quite know enough about the details of how they work. But as I understood, it could be, there are reasons to think that it could be talked about as what I'm calling a micro level feature in the model. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Hi, Eric.
Hey, Eric.
Yeah.
I do have a, sorry, Mike, you fire ahead.
Yeah, I think you spoke first. Go on.
Well, first of all, Emily, thanks for that. That was that's really cool, actually, and it's got me thinking about a couple of things. I'm just going to throw out one comment, which is just a kind of a potentially a parallel description that I've partly used to understand the different points of view. So the more critical view of simulations seem to be in sort of psychologist speak, which is my native tongue, as it were, is this distinction that's made between assimilation and accommodation in the dealing with new information. And if the new information fits easily into your conceptual scheme, however that might be described or theorized, then you might learn something new, but it doesn't change the way you think about the world, as it were. Whereas accommodation forces you to change the way you think about the world. And the sort of simple way of summarizing the attitude of the kinds of scientists that you quoted at the beginning of your talk was that experiments can force accommodation, whereas simulations, all you'll ever get is assimilation. And so kind of with that in mind, I was convinced by your argument. I think, now I was probably sympathetic before we started, but that kind of simple dichotomy of, simulations will never force you to sort of shift your perspective. It's just not very appealing and not very convincing. But you did raise the question of there would be specific contexts in which there would be a difference in how useful the surprise would be that could be generated by experiments versus simulations. And in some circumstances, surprise in simulations might be more useful or more productive. And in other situations, surprise from experiments might be more productive. And I was kind of wondering then, am I making sense so far? I suppose that's turning into turning into one of those long questions. The sort of short finish to the question is, what might the interesting variables be that determine when surprise will be more productive? And it struck me that partly driven by the brief conversation we had before you started your talk, was that where an ecology or an ecosystem or the kind of the whole was important, you might find experiments being more important because there's going to be a host of variables that you haven't controlled for because you don't know about them. But where in situations where the ecology isn't playing a substantial role in the dynamics of what you're interested in, then simulations will offer as much, if not more, in terms of their potential to produce productive surprise.
Yeah.
But I suppose my question really is, are there any other variables, or have you given any thought to what particular circumstances those two things would differ?
Yeah, so, first of all, thanks for the assimilation accommodation distinction. That's helpful way to think about it. Although, as you said, I think I don't think it's as much of a dichotomy between changing the way we think about the world versus not, as people have wanted it to be. But yeah, about the usefulness of surprises point. So in the longer paper, I make some distinctions about reasons that surprises are valuable, which I talk about in terms of productivity. And by productivity, I mean surprises are valuable because they're productive in the sense that they drive further research, and in particular, not just quantitatively drive further research, but drive researchers to explore new parts of conceptual or empirical space that they haven't explored previously. Mm-hmm. So one way that a surprise can be directly valuable is by being productive in that sense of motivating exploration of new space. Another way it can be productive is by revealing something that is ultimately revealing about the particular target of inquiry in nature. And I think that in a field experimental context and in many lab experimental contests, you might be more likely to get that second sort of value from surprise, the sort of something is surprising and it ends up telling you directly about the thing in nature you wanted to learn about. Like something goes wonky in my study of crows in the lab, I am likely to learn something about crows in general from it. Whereas in a modeling context, I think you might be less likely to get that sort of value out of surprise, but equally likely to get what I want to call broad productivity. So if you're studying a mathematical model in the context of ecology and something goes funny in your model, you're less likely to be in a position to say, oh, this thing that went funny in the model tells me directly about how things go funny in natural populations of organisms. But if something goes funny in the model because you were using a random number generator and it didn't work quite the way you thought, you might learn something incredibly productive in the context of learning about mathematics and computation. Cool. So I think when people talk about value from experiments versus models, they usually only have in mind the second sort of thing I was talking about, the learning directly about your target in nature. So, and I think this sense of productive surprises, teaching you something new, period, that might take you into space that wasn't where you started out, is often overlooked.
Cool.
I guess you can carry that over to, sorry, you go ahead, Eric.
I would say that part's often overlooked because it doesn't lead easily into a standard scientific career. I've been told before. I was, by the way, watching the whole thing on YouTube before, so.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say you can sort of carry what you were just saying, Emily, over into the context of sort of more typical experiment design. You know, in a lab, like you could have some surprising result, and then you learn about how your test tubes are working or how something's going on inside your physical apparatus, and that's sort of analogous to your random number generator.
Yeah, exactly.
Scenario. Yeah. Which incidentally, I had once. I had a very, very strange bug from a random number generator that I was using in a strange way. So that's not a fabricated example. Yeah.
Oh, cool. I should get you to tell me about it so that
I will.
I'm using a fabricated example.
Yeah.
What
Hi.
would like to be in talk that I would.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I'm going to say, Mike, why don't you go ahead and talk because you haven't had a chance yet.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think I was about to start at the same time as Marek, wasn't I? But then Marek went, and now I'll have a go. Thank you. Yeah, so I enjoyed the talk, Emily. Thank you.
Thanks.
Unlike Marek, I am a fan of the idea that real experiments can be confounding, not just surprising, where I suppose I'm taking confounding to be some kind of word for some kind of additional type of surprise that you can't get from pure simulations. I mean, you said yourself something about re-evaluating our theoretical framework, which is one attempt to characterize what that additional type of surprise might be. But I sort of liked it as a word that just gave the sense that there was some additional type of surprise that you could get from experiments and not from simulations. It seems to me that would certainly be true. For like three reasons I've thought of. I mean, one is that I think the world itself is arbitrarily detailed. For instance, does quantum mechanics matter to the behavior of an ironing board or a table? I'm not sure, but does it matter to the behavior of solid state matter in general? Definitely. And the more we know about quantum mechanics, the more we understand and can predict macroscopic physical matter. So the world's arbitrarily detailed, and we don't know at what level that detail may or may not matter to some real large-scale effect. The world's also arbitrarily coupled in the sense that we never can be sure without doing the experiment which other part of the world is actually relevant to the part of the world we're studying. Because, you know, when real physical objects are basically always coupled in some more or less trivial sense with other objects, you know, because of sort of thermodynamics and heat transfer, whether that coupling matters is something you can't be sure about, although you can have presuppositions. And those are two reasons to think that real experiments will always be, in some sense, have the potential for an additional type of surprise. And one third reason, it seems to me sort of trivial, which means I suspect that someone's going to tell me why they think it's wrong. But you can't have a simulation unless you have a model. And you can do an experiment without a model. Which seems to me to suppose that you're accessing some different type of information when you do an experiment. At least in principle, can access a different type of information.
Well, when you're putting together an experiment, don't you need to have some kind of model? I mean, generally when you're designing an experiment, you're asking some kind of question. you've got a model that you're trying to.
Okay, you need some macroscopic model, but yeah, okay, fair enough. So that's a good point as to why it's wrong. But it still seems to me that, I mean, if I want to know how gold behaves, and I want you to do that simulation to get the little wires, I'd have to have a very detailed model. But if I'd done the actual experiment, I wouldn't have had to have a detailed model. I could have just done the experiment and seen the little wires forming if I'd known to look.
Mm-hmm.
I think we might be using model in a slightly different sense, or I might be using it in a more restrictive sense. So this is something that gets confused in the philosophical literature on this stuff a bit, because sometimes people say people use simulation and model interchangeably, and sometimes simulation means study of a model. But so what I have in mind broadly for this comparison is the difference between studying physical stuff in the lab or the field, regardless of whether or not there's any modeling going on in the background, the study of a physical system versus the study of a mathematical or computational construct that's meant to represent something else. So
yeah, that's the distinction I thought you were making.
Okay, good.
I mean, you can't do a simulation in the sense of studying implementing the maths that's meant to implement something else, unless you have some maths that's meant to represent the thing you want to study. But you can study a thing without having maths without having maths that represents in detail how the thing behaves. You might just say, I know there's this thing, how does it behave?
Mm-hmm.
You don't need the maths. You'd have to begin to ask the question of a simulation to ask the same kind of questions of reality, it seems to me.
Can I just ask then, is the argument that experiments, and so I didn't take, Emily, I didn't take it for you to be saying that experiments and simulations are essentially equal.
No, not at all.
Or equivalent, right? So the sort of the question then, Mike, is what is the particular claim that you're arguing? So I think it is. I think you're absolutely right. Is that there are obviously some kinds of surprises that can only happen through experiments, due to the existence of things like coupling and so on. So that's one claim that I don't think anyone's going to dispute.
I misunderstood then, Emily, to actually be disputing that. Sorry.
Okay. So then the sort of the other question, the other claim then, it I suppose comes back to, I think it was your second notion about surprise, which was, do simulations produce fewer or likely to produce fewer surprises, which is essentially an empirical claim rather than a logical one. Is there, and I suppose that becomes a matter of how many experiments do you do versus how many simulations you do, and what kinds of questions you ask with those two sets of methods.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree about the points about the world being arbitrarily detailed and arbitrarily coupled and that mattering. So yeah, again, I don't want to dispute that. But so, I mean, a few things there. One is people often talk about experiments as part of the world and models as not part of the world, which always seems really strange to me. I think everything that we study as scientists is part of the real world, unless people mean something really different than I do by real world. I think when people say that kind of thing, what they usually have in mind is when we learn something in an experiment, we're learning something about stuff out in nature in a way that we don't when we learn about a model. And while I think that's sometimes, or perhaps even often, closer to true, the point I was trying to push back on with the last slide that I went through quite quickly is that except in really, really limited set of field experiment cases, you're always studying something as a stand-in for something else, and there's always some degree of abstraction, leaving stuff out, idealization going on in designing a model, of course, but also an experimental system. So I think it's true that there's, I think, richer opportunities to learn about more detailed things, or to be surprised by more sort of micro features for exactly the reasons you mentioned, the complexity and coupling when you study a physical system as opposed to a mathematical construct. But the thing I really want to push back on is that that puts you in a better position to automatically infer something about the world outside the thing you're studying. Because, especially I think the experimental evolution cases like the one I mentioned are a great example, where when you learn something, you're learning something about 12 populations of E. coli in an extremely artificial lab setting. And the idea that that puts you in a position to infer something about about evolving populations generally could be questioned pretty strongly depending on the kind of inference you want to draw.
But I mean, if the world's arbitrarily kind of coupled in the way I was trying to get at, if you set up a simulation based on a model, you would be assuming that that the model is sufficient. I mean, you can't, it can't not be, really. The behavior you're going to get is the behavior from the model. You're not going to get some other part of the world coming in and affecting the model in ways you didn't expect, because the model is a set of formal rules, and there's nothing in the formal rules for the rest of the world to affect it. But if you study a real physical system, and your expectation is that you can set up this system reliably and repeatably and study that system and see how this part of it interacts with this other part of it, you may be surprised and find you just can't. There's this other thing you didn't understand, which is another part of the world which is affecting it. That's I mean, it's a source of surprise that can't happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And it's a good point to emphasize here. Although again, the interference that you get from the rest of the world in your experimental system isn't necessarily more valuable in the sense of teaching you something important about the thing you were trying to study. It could turn out to just be a bug, very much like a bug in your computer code.
It sometimes is, and it can be, and it's certainly a case of teaching about the world, which is the issue in question.
Mm.
But as in the random number generator example, you could say that's analogous, right? You say you're learning something about the world, which is the random number generator in this case.
Yeah, but that's because
it's not what you're studying.
That was because your simulation. Okay, so the way the simulation. I mean, I think this is possibly quite a subtle point, but if that simulation did teach you something about the world, it was precisely because you failed to implement your simulation qua implementation of the formal rules you had in mind. It wasn't an implementation.
But you say exactly
the
the same
analogous thing
about
could be said about experimental settings, that when you're working with bacteria, if something goes wrong, it's often contamination.
We're talking about, okay, I thought we were talking about the value of discovering the formal properties, that the unexpected macroscopic properties of a formal model. I mean, if we're going to include discoveries you make when you get the implementation wrong, then it becomes much harder to draw a boundary. I'd agree.
So I'm interested in possibly flipping that point on its head, and I caught most of the talk earlier. Hopefully this point wasn't made. In psychology at least, are of the form that a certain number of variables can account for some outcome through a very specific process. And in fact, there's actually no way to experimentally verify that claim. The only way, I mean, aside from actually taking over somebody's entire life in very unethical ways, there's no way to verify that claim. The only way to verify that claim is to run a simulated population. And what you might find there, sort of flipping around the argument that was just made, is in fact that you're clearly not identifying all the crucial variables. So in an experiment, you might find that something else affects it, but in the simulation, you can find that for sure you need to account for other things.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's a nice sort of, I'm just writing that down. That's a nice way to make exactly the point that the sorts of insights that are valuable can depend on the context, and sometimes the abstraction and idealization are a better way to get insights than all of the messy stuff that comes along for free with studying the world. Yeah, but I mean, again, part of my whole big point in this broader project about experiments versus models is to argue that there are all these interesting stories about particular contexts like this, where by context, I mean research sub-area, but also class of situations driven by a particular kind of question. And while there might be interesting claims to make there about experiments or models being preferable for some reason, we can't extrapolate from those to claims about experiments being better in science, period.
Cool. Well, I know Emily said that she's got some students coming at 10, and that's getting kind of close. So I think that's a reasonable place to sort of wrap things up. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Thank you so much, Emily, for presenting. Got some good discussion going. And
Frozen
anybody, anybody who wants to partake in the discussion further on the ENSO Seminars website, we do have a forum for discussion. And I will encourage Emily, if I can, to respond to questions there if there are further comments. So go to ensoseminars.com to find that page. And thanks again, Emily, and thank you everybody for joining us. And we're going off the air.
Thank you very much.